I am Fritz Koepp, Koepp, and I'm a registered professional forester in California. I grew up at a dairy farm in northwestern Wisconsin. My father was a farm manager, and in those days, farm kids had to go to work immediately. You know, they just worked 5, 6 years old. You were out working. Well, my father's a farm manager. He had his partner had 2 grandsons. So I was able to live in a fantasy world of playing cowboy for all those summers. And so instead of being a farm kid and going to work, I could live in this fantasy world of being a cowboy. And my father owned acreage on Red Cedar Lake in Wisconsin, and I used to roam the hills, and live out my fantasies there. And so when I was in about 7th grade, I read a book called Hank Winton, Smoke Chaser. And it was a Forest Service. Monty Atwater wrote books for, he was a Forest Service, had been Forest Service, and he wrote for that age people. And he wrote Avalanche Patrol. So I really got interested in forestry, and so when I was in high school, I read a book called Tall Timber Pilots. And Tall Timber Pilots was the history of the Johnson Flying Service out of Missoula, Montana. And there was a chapter in there about smoke jumping. And I said, if I ever get a chance, I want to do that. I didn't go to school to become a forester. I went to school to become a district ranger in the Forest Service, because I had read about it in the old days when a ranger rode around with a .45 pistol and a .44 rifle and on a horse and riding the range and doing what they did. And so that was my idea, and that's what I thought. And of course, by the time I graduated from a forestry school, rangers didn't do that anymore. They were business managers. When I went to college, my pastor had recommended that I go to St. Olaf College to think about becoming a minister, which I knew I wanted forestry, but I said, well, I'll give it a chance. I'll see what happens. So I went to St. Olaf College, and I used to go. I got my prereqs for forestry there. And in fact, our chemistry professor was a guy named Finn Holt, who had worked on the atomic bomb. But I used to go. Carleton College was across the river in Northfield, Minnesota, and I used to go over there to read American Forests, because I just, forestry is what I wanted. And so at the end of the year, then I got into the University of Minnesota. I'd taken all the prereqs for college, fortunately, in high school. And so in those days, there was no real competition. If you had the prereqs, there was no competition to get in. They wanted kids to go to college. They were looking for people. Can you imagine? There was no competition. In those days, University of Minnesota was considered to be the second best forestry school in the United States. Yale was number 1, but they only had a graduate degree program. So I like to think that since University of Minnesota had an undergraduate program, that maybe it might have been the best. Who knows? And of course, but if you work out in California, Cal, with all due respect to any place, Humboldt State and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and Humboldt. But anyway, but Minnesota educated people to be for all over the United States. And So we were educated in multiple use management. What happened is you're supposed to go to the summer camp when you're a freshman, but most of the students at the University of Minnesota waited till their senior year. And so by the time I went to summer camp, I'd already taken all the courses, so I knew I knew the academic parts. So it was just the field work that I had to. And it was kind of interesting because I learned to use a compass, and my crew partner and I, we would fight the hazelbrush. And the hazelbrush was, in Minnesota, was like a weed. And, of course, out here we eat hazelnuts. It's kind of interesting. And I don't know if they grow them back there or not, but, if they, harvest them back there. But anyway, that was, and the number of spring camp, which in those days, we had a spring camp that we went to at Koepp Experimental Forest in Minnesota. And I worked part-time for a guy named Gordy Gullion, who was later became the world's expert on ruffed grouse, and I've got some of his books up there. And he was probably the hardest working person I've ever known. Well, he might have been, yeah. Anyway, he's a very hard-working guy and very smart, and so I learned about work ethic from him. And I had a Chevy convertible, and I used to go out to, part of my job, my paying job, was to go out and count the male ruffed grouse on the drumming logs. The males would get up and they would drum, flap their wings and make a drumming sound to attract the females. And so my job was to watch for that and record it. And it just so happened that year there wasn't much going on with but that happens. That's nature's. This would be 1963. Let's see. Wait a minute. I graduated in 60, so it would be 1959. And and I also sold candy bars to make a little money, and ate the profits. No profits, but anyway, it was a job. It kept me busy, and one of the my classmates who never paid much attention. He was a quiet guy. Name was Paul Ellefson, and he went on and got his PhD in forest policy, and I have his textbook that he wrote. And but you never know it from when you're in college, you don't notice quiet people that much. And then my crew partner, Louis Sedheimer, he and I were good friends, and later he became the best man at our wedding. Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, I remember is Frank Coffert, the dean of the forestry school, and he was very down-to-earth and practical, and he was one of these people that wanted to see people graduate. And then there was Brownie, the mensuration teacher, who was another one. They were all very practical and down-to-earth people, but I certainly remember him. In fact, he would, for summer forestry camp, he'd give it maybe an hour-long lecture, and at the end he would say, "No, be good. If you can't be good, be careful." And so since I was working my way through college, paying out-of-state tuition, I wouldn't take any chances. But it was really funny because my crew partner, who wanted to drink beer, and I was a teetotaler in those days, we'd go to this place called Qualley's, and he would want a beer, but that they wouldn't give them a beer, and they would offer me a beer, and I said, no, no thanks. I came into the Air Force through the back door. I qualified for officer school, officer training school, and it was they had this program for college graduates where they don't treat you like a recruit, and they do in basic training. They call you Mister, and you were had a sergeant's rating for pay purposes, but everybody was called Mister, and so I went to officers training school, and our first assignment was to in class was to plan a bombing run on Moscow, and so I wouldn't do it. I said, in fact, I checked. I went to the library and found out you could resign, and called self-initiated elimination. And so I went before the board of review, and I said, I'm willing to fight other soldiers. I'm willing to fight bomb commercial targets. I'm willing to bomb industrial targets, but I will not bomb civilians. And in those days, the policy was blanket, and it's kind of blanket bombing. And it's interesting, in Afghanistan, they're very careful to target, so that they target the soldiers and avoid collateral damage. But back in those days, it was blanket. So anyway, I told them that's what I said I wouldn't do it. So they said, well, okay, goodbye. So what I found out was that was my officer's career, if you want to call it that. Now, I would have been a navigator bombardier, by the way. And I noticed the navigator part, but I didn't think about the bombing part. When you're young, you don't notice things like that. At least I didn't notice. And so what I found out was when you resign, you're put in inactive status, inactive reserves. And this is, 1961. And so that's what happened. And I was immediately... I got reinstated in the Forest Service, and no, not yet. Went to San Francisco and went to law school. And anyway, I was assigned to Fort Miley in San Francisco as a postal clerk. And Fort Miley is on a hill across from this big, beautiful museum in San Francisco. And so that was my assignment there. And let's see. So I went to law school, and how shall I say? First-year law students don't enjoy it. I mean, it's just. I went to Hastings College of Law, which had low entrance requirements, but I did pass the LSAT I got in, but they told me to think like a lawyer, and I don't like to be told how to think, for one thing. And I also had my first failure when I took a part-time job teaching chemistry at Heald Engineering School down the street. And the last 2 weeks, I gave out the final exam, and two guys sitting next to each other had turned in identical papers. I flunked them both. And so now is Heald Engineering School is for rich people send their kids to get a cheap degree. And so instead of flunking them, they fired me. And so then I went on to law school, and it was when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. We were sitting in class one morning and got the announcement that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. First it was shot, but then later died. And so I had a lot of emotional trauma because Kennedy really meant a lot to me. And and also I made it through forestry school being a cooperating That's what forestry students do. We cooperated. But to think like a lawyer, you got to be competitive and think like a lawyer, of course. And let's see. I went to so I knew I was going to flunk out, but I stayed in for the whole year, and so I enjoyed law school. And in those days, when law professors got to be 62, they were forced to retire, and so we had the best law professors in the United States would retire, like Prosser, who was. They even made a movie about him. Based on him, and we had like I say, all the best. Perkins on criminal law, and the others, and so I actually enjoyed first year law school when everybody else has a different experience, shall we say? And but I did meet. And also, one of the things that really affected me was there were two basic motivations of the law students. One was their parents made them go, or two, they wanted to make a lot of money. And so I'd gone there for a third thing called justice and fairness, and I don't teach you that. At least, by the end, if you stay out for 3 years, you might figure those things out, but that's not the point of law school, apparently. At least it was in those days. So I left law school and got reinstated in the Forest Service. Was assigned to the Angeles National Forest, and where I did watershed surveys. And fortunately, I had a boss who had a good sense of humor, a nice guy. And the SoCal Edison was looking for a forester. Edison is in the electrical business, not power business. It is a power business, but not the forestry business. And so Clem Crouch, the deputy forest supervisor, chose 3 people to go for an interview with Edison for this forestry job, and the first guy, Art Default, the assistant district ranger on the Arroyo Seco district, didn't even go, and he later became supervisor on the Chippewa National Forest. And then, so they left 2 of us, Norm Scott and myself. Now, Norm Scott had worked with Edison when they built the power lines coming down off of Cajon Pass, Interstate 5, and so Edison knew him, and so Norm and I went for the interview, and I got a call. Probably the most critical decision that I ever made in forestry was to even go for the interview, because I wasn't interested, because I still want to be a district ranger in the Forest Service. So my wife said, Mary Ann said, well, just go for the interview, you see what happens. So I said, okay. So I went for the interview, and of course I wanted the job, and but they offered the job to the other guy, and because they knew him, he just they knew him, did a good job. So I got a phone call, and they said, we're offering the job. You did a good job in the interview, but we're offering the job to Norm. So I was very disappointed, and but the next day I get another call, and they said, well, Norm turned us down because he'd had benefits that built up over time, and he had some time in the Forest Service. So I got the job, and it's probably the beginning of the best forestry job that I ever had, because I functioned as the how shall I say? Well, like an assistant forester, but I was forestry and water rights agent. I did the paperwork for the forester up at Shaver Lake, and then I also learned water rights. So I was responsible for all the Edison underground water rights in California, and filed the field offices would turn in their reports, and I would send all that in to the state to maintain water rights. But I did I did the paperwork for the forest, and I wrote timber sale contracts or modified them and all that sort of thing. What happened is go to Shaver Lake to supervise campground clearing for the summer up there in it was the year that Nixon resigned, so it'd be 74, I think. And so we moved up there for the summer while I supervised campground clearing, and the family was there too. And we rented this house on the point, Shaver Lake Point, and we called it the Goat House. It was really on a steep hill. Anyway, all our friends, we never knew we had so many friends. They all came to visit that summer because, from down here, it was a big deal being at Shaver Lake. Anyway, they were there, and they came to visit. And then so at the end of the summer, our department manager came up. And I told him, I said, now, Bill Wingo, the forester, said, if he wants to retire, I'm ready. I'd like to, become the forester. And so he talked to Bill Wingo, and Bill, I don't know if he'd planned, well, for whatever reason, he retired. So then I became the forester for the company up there. When Edison's approach, when I was at Shaver Lake, and was to, they're saying you can't please all the people all the time, but Edison tried to please all of the people all the time. And with multiple use management, I think we did that. Edison was the first company in California to have a tree farm on the American tree farm system. So they were pioneers in this. What really, how shall I say, caused me to leave Shaver Lake was this terrible school situation. But then also, I'd always said, if I ever get a chance to go back to Alaska, if it pays anything more than I make here. So with the cost of living allowance, I got an offer to go to Alaska, and for a few dollars more. It's like the Clint Eastwood movie, for a few dollars more. But that was that job, and that terrible school situation for the high school, because both of our kids were going to be going into high school. They would have been subjected to this terrible, terrible attitude. So I take the job in Alaska, and I'm a fire ecologist for the Bureau of Land Management. And it just so happens that I was hired by my boss's boss, because my boss was so hated that he would be blackballed for any time he'd put in for a job to transfer. He would be blackballed. Bill Gabriel, Dr. Bill Gabriel, Ph.D. He had a bachelor's in forestry and his master's or his Ph.D. in wildlife management, and he was brilliant. He was a gentleman. He was from Virginia, a gentleman. He was really nice. He treated me with courtesy and respect. But he was away on a forestry trip, and so his boss hired me. And so I get up there, and in the dead of it was like December, and it just so happens my aunt and uncle live in Eagle River outside of Anchorage, and so we stayed with them. In Alaska, people just take care of each other. My aunt and uncle had an apartment like downstairs, or my wife and family, and we stayed in this room downstairs and did our cooking and everything, eating down there. And and then after 3 months we bought our house, and went on from there. But in the meantime, I was working for this Bill Gabriel had come back from his trip, and I met, and but he wanted. I'm a dirt forester, and he wanted. What shall I say? Well, he wanted a PhD. Is what he wanted, which I am not. Not even close. Yeah, as you might guess. And so he wanted me to. He gave us some chores to do with writing some simple things, which is not a big deal. But one of the most exciting things that I got to participate in was working on the 40-mile fire plan, which was the first interagency fire plan in the United States. And I think there were 13 different native corporations. They had, of course, the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Fish and Wildlife from Alaska, and all the different organizations got together to work on this fire plan. And Dick O'Connell, who was the fire management officer for all of Alaska, he liked me, and so he got me involved in what they call the Alaska Fire Team. And so I got to go to Marana, Arizona for advanced fire management, and it was like, I guess, a 2-week school. And my boss's boss now, because people liked him, he was acceptable, and so he and I actually worked on drafting that fire plan when we were down at Marana. But I also got to go. He took me on he had a weekend. I had a car, and we were in Marana's not too far from Nogales. So we had this weekend. I went down to Nogales, and it was safe in those days. There was nothing like it is now. But so I had a good time there and came back. And at Marana, I think I had my first margarita. Oh, the conflicts. Okay. First of all, in those days, everybody treated me with courtesy and respect. There was no problem. But I did have, talk about conflict, this guy, Dale Woodward, he was my boss. And so he and I did not agree on much of anything. And so finally he sent me to conflict management and class. And so we went to a few sessions, and the instructor said, Fritz, you ought to resign. You ought to quit the company. And in those days, it was the time of the spotted owl, and a lot of foresters were out of work, and besides, I didn't want to move. I had family down here, and we didn't want to move anyway, so I just decided to hang in there. And, as it turns out, I was covered by what they call in the Edison the 58 plan, which is an excellent health plan. And Mary Ann, with her cancer, it's been millions of dollars, and she would not be alive today if it wasn't for that health insurance. And of course, it covers me too, but I, don't have any major issues. But anyway, so if I had if I had quit, of course, I would not have had any of that. So, yeah, it was really worth the stay. But just fortunately, I didn't have any other place to go, so I just did that, and it ended up being. I interviewed for this job. I was a right-of-way agent for a number of years and did a lot of different things for Edison as a right-of-way agent, but then I interviewed for a job, Associate Fire Control and Conservation Representative, and got that job. And that is, by the time they forced me to retire, I like to think enjoyed it so much, I would have done it if I didn't get paid for it. It was just that much fun. And let's see. Oh, I was on call 24 hours a day to go to fires, but most of the fires were little minor, didn't amount to anything. If it was a big fire, I would go out and then meet with the fire chiefs and whoever's in charge, and represent Edison's interests. There was no formal protocol in those days for including Edison on ongoing fires, and so Edison's concern was especially smoke getting in the transmission lines, and it can shut down, cause what we call a relay. It can shut down. It can black out Southern California. That's why they justified that job, because that was that important. So I was on call 24 hours. But then the fun part was I played golf with fire. I went to golf tournaments and played golf with fire chiefs and then the golf tournaments. And I call myself the highest scoring, lowest paid professional golfer in Southern California. And that was really a lot of fun. And so I did that for 4 years. And when I was at my last year, a guy named Captain Meehan in the Los Angeles County Fire Department wrote an article in Fire Control Notes talking about the 4 worst wind corridors in Southern California. And one of those was Malibu area. And at the time, Edison was considering to reduce the underground grid fire protection to save money at Malibu substation. So I wrote this memo to my boss, and I just quoted this article verbatim. And at the end, I said it would not be prudent to modify the protection standards. And so I did this. My boss had put me in charge of our group while he was on vacation. This just happened it just happened when he was gone. So he came back. He never said a word, and then about a week later, he called me into his office with his boss and got my hand slapped for doing that. Well, it didn't seem like a big deal at the time, but later, when it was time, at the end of December, I had a chance to retire. Howard Allen, who was the chairman of the board at the time, he had tried to take over San Diego Gas and Electric and lost. They wouldn't go for it, and so he got the board of directors to approve let's say a full health plan if you were age 55, which I was. And so I had a chance to retire, but I was so happy doing my job, I didn't even think about retiring. And so they were cutting the budget. I was the highest paid man in a 5-man group. And so, and like this, January 2nd or 3rd, right after we went back to work, my boss, instead of being friendly, he was not friendly anymore. He took away all my privilege and said, "You can't go to the field anymore. You're going to fill out fire extinguisher tags." And then next day there was something else, and I finally figured, oh, he wants me to retire. And so, sure, I retired. So I don't know if it was the memo or cutting the budget or all of the above, something, but they got rid of me. And so I planned on retiring at Edison. You would retire. You would plan on retiring at age 62 and 30 years. I had 27 years, and I was age 55. So I quote retired with minimum pension and fortunately, Mary Ann had a good job as a teacher, kept us going. Yeah, when how shall I say? Oh, I wrote that memo, and to my boss about the dangerous wind corridor and the Malibu Canyon, and so I had been going as part of my job. I was had joined and was a member of the Forester and Fire Wardens. It's the Southern California Association of Foresters and Fire Wardens, and that has been around for about, I don't know, 50, 100 years. It's been a long time since they were organized, and so those were the people. They're very important to me because, or what still are. When my boss was checking around after I'd written that memo, he was trying to find dirt to dig up, I guess, or something, I don't know, or catch me in a lie. And the Forester and Fire Wardens people were the ones that stood behind me and supported me. So when I'd been a member for a number of years as part of my job, and so after I was fired from my job, they elected me as an honorary life member of the Forester and Fire Wardens. Usually, being a life member means firemen have been for many years. I knew very well, and worked their way up through the ranks, that sort of thing. And so, and now when they take away the honorary parts, and when I go to the meetings, it's just life member now. So that's but anyway, they're the ones that stood behind me and supported me during that time. And I still go to the meetings. I have a 2-day, it's about a 2-day meeting every year. And we usually go to a place called Oak Glen, northeast of San Bernardino. And so it's a 2-day, and we camp out. It's a church camp, but they have cabins. We stay under that. And anyway, it's a really a good experience, and the meetings are always worthwhile. What they do is, every agency has their own training sessions and so on, and the Forester and Fire Wardens is an opportunity for people from all the different agencies to get together and exchange notes, and then we have speakers and things, people, and they always have an excellent program. So I usually go every year to that. So they're extremely important to me. Oh yes, John. Now, I laugh when I say that because, how shall I say, John Mount is brilliant, okay, and when I resigned to go up to join the BLM, that's another story, but John Mount was, he interviewed for the job that I was an incumbent, in any job you ever have in an organization, you're an incumbent, temporarily filling a position. And John Mount, so when I retired, when I went to Alaska to become the fire ecologist for the state up there, John Mount interviewed, and my best friend at Edison was on a committee to select my replacement. And so his name was the guy that was the supervisor, property management supervisor. Don Baumann made the cast a deciding vote to hire John Mount. And When I came back from the Bureau of Land Management, I was back at Edison working as a right-of-way agent, and John Mount was a bull in a china closet. Is that the word? Yeah. And he was, well, he just rattled a lot of cages, and they wanted, our environmental department guys wanted to fire him and all that sort of thing. And so my good friend asked me, he said, well, you know what? I said, well, I got no reason to, because I knew nothing about John Mount, really. But, he wasn't doing anything unethical. He was, as far as I knew him, my information. So, anyway, John Mount, how shall I say, when I was a forester at Shaver Lake, I did cookbook forestry, and that's what the company wanted, multiple use management, and I did that for a few years up there. But when they brought in John Mount, empire builder, he's an empire builder, and he's brilliant. He's a brilliant forester. He's, he went on to, I had, how should I say, I had a timber scaler and a temporary planning crew, and two firemen, two fire patrol in the summer. That's what I did, and that's all the company wanted. And when John Mount got up there, we had a new department manager, and the company's attitude had changed. They wanted a more, I would say, assertive, maybe aggressive management philosophy. So John Mount was just in a perfect position to do that. And so he comes in, he's a company forester, and the first thing he does is, one of the first things, he changes the title from forester to forest manager, and he takes over Camp Edison. Camp Edison was run by a separate group, so he's in charge of that now too. He's got all Camp Edison, he's got the forestry, and then he hires up to about, let's say, I think he has 9 or 10 on his staff, had 9 or 10, like a wildlife biologist, a forest mensurationist, various specialties. So he had this big staff, and he went on to become a favorite of the chairman of the board, John Bryson, who was an environmentalist, by the way. And so, and John had really built up the program and was very great, and he changed our permanent plot system, and he had figured out, a better way to do that. And so he did, and plus, he was also president of a timber organization as I recall. In the end, by the time he retired, he won the Francis Raymond Award. Have you interviewed him? Oh, so I don't need to tell you all this. You know more than I do about it. But anyway, he was brilliant, and he was also. We had one thing we had in common was he was. Prescribed fire was his thing. It was my thing too. I helped get it started on Edison lands when I was up at Shaver Lake, through the Kings River Deer Herd Project, and I got to know the Ron Bertram and Ron Rempel and Fred Brueggemann. Fred Brueggemann taught me a lot about prescribed fire. So we got started doing prescribed fire on Edison. I like to think that I was one of the first in California to do prescribed fire on private lands for silvicultural purposes. Now, it was allegedly for the deer herd, but I was also thinking of the silvicultural purposes. And so we got, and it was interesting when that, to get that program going, the representatives from the California the Fish and Game Department came down to, we invited them to come down to Rosemead to meet with my boss and the department manager. And my boss has said, now, he was a property management supervisor. He said, now look, you can make your proposal, and then we'll think about it, and then see what happens. So they make the pitch. Ron Rempel, Ron Bertram, and Fred Brueggemann, and so they tell their story. Oh, and Norm Allstott was our wildlife biologist for Edison, and he worked up in the Big Creek area, and so he was there, and so we were all in this meeting, and it just so happened that Paul Peacock, the department manager, he was also a member of the Wildlife Society, so he was, on board with, everything they wanted, really. So he listened to their pitch and he said, "Yeah, let's do it." He made the decision right there. That was it's unusual for Edison. They brought everything through committee and going on and on. Anyway, so the program that got the Kings River Deer Herd Project. We got involved in that. And then, of course, John Mount being, and also a prescribed fire. He was, I thought I was a fireman, but he was, really, went, how shall I say, well, very strongly in favor of it, to put it mildly. And he started a very aggressive burning prescribed fire program at Shaver Lake, so picked up where I'd left off, and then he went on and he did an outstanding job for Edison, and of course you've already talked to him, so so if I say anything that conflicts with what he told you, that take his word for it. Wow. I guess my favorite is the combination of field work and office work. For instance, at Big Bar, when I started out as a timber cruiser and appraiser, I got tired of beating the brush all of that time and being in the field, but the appraisal work was really fascinating to me. And in the Forest Service we use this we call it conversion return appraisal, and yeah, she knows what that is. And it's a very elaborate system where you take into account all the costs of production and logging and everything. And so we would go through all this elaborate process and appraise the timber, which quite often would end up being even negative. Well, I'd say quite often, but sometimes negative. And of course, the loggers, when they come in to bid, they bet on the fact that the Forest Service would not enforce the contract. And they had to build a lot of roads, and the Forest Service, if they built these highly engineered roads, beautiful superhighway type things, the Forest Service couldn't maintain them. They didn't have the money to maintain them. I don't know what, anyway. It wasn't realistic. But anyway, that's what we did, and we went through the whole process, and then, so we'd come up with a price, and then the loggers they'd bid it all up, because of the competition, betting on the fact that we would enforce the contract. And so I guess that would be one of my favorite things there. And being, actually, my favorite part, though, was when I was forester at Shaver Lake, because here, once again, we were doing multiple use management, and had a little bit of fire, and then prescribed fire. My first job on the Big Bar District, the Shasta Trinity National Forest, the ranger really enjoyed new foresters coming in because he could get out of the office, and he had a Jeep, World War II Jeep, to take me for a ride, and he liked to side hill and scare me. And of course, I'd grown up learning. I learned to drive with a Jeep. At least I knew that part. But with the side hilling on, I just thought we might tip over. But he'd done it enough, so he knew what he was doing. And so that got me started, and in forestry. Bill Wingo at Shaver Lake, when he was company forester. I would say he was a informal mentor because he was probably the best field forester I've ever known. We had 18,000 acres at Shaver Lake, and I think he knew every square inch. And I used to go up on inspection trips when I was down in the Rosemead office, and I'd pull out my maps and so on. And he just knew where everything was. And he was also one of the finest human beings I've ever known. He was, the epitome of, I think, of being a Christian. And he never said anything about that. He just he lived the life. And so I guess he was certainly, an informal mentor. I didn't have any formal mentors. I think in Edison, when I tried to get promoted, I was not a company man. You got to. I call it selling your soul to the devil. Actually, that's how I started in the Forest Service, as a smoke jumper, and let's see, backing up a little bit. I'm repeating, I guess, but I read about it. Tunnel timber pilots. I said I wanted to do it if I get a chance. I was at St. Olaf College, and this guy comes walking down the hall, Ken Root, and he says, "Anybody want to be a smoke jumper?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." And so I signed up, and it came out here, and back in those days, we didn't have a tarmac at least we didn't call it that. We were in Redding, California, at the old Cal Fire barracks. Bill Snyder might know about them. And we would get a call, and we had a Stakeside truck, and we get in the truck, and it was 10 miles out to the airport. And so then we go out there, and we'd suit up and get on the plane and go to a fire. And that's one of the ways that my wife, I had a picture of me in my smoke jumper outfit standing by the airplane, and I sent her this picture, and she was impressed by that. I've got 41 static line jumps, 10 practice jumps in the Forest Service, 14 fire jumps, plus a couple others when I came back the second year. And in smoke jumping, we used what's called the Derry chute, D-E-R-R-Y, named after Frank Derry, who invented it. And I did want to make a brief comment about the 101 1st Airborne Division, because in 1940, the smoke jumpers were operating, and the Army out of Fort Benning, Georgia, they sent out this major to learn about you can jump out of airplanes and that sort of thing. So then he went back to Fort Benning, and he started the 101 1st Airborne Division, and so they learned it from the smoke jumpers, which I think it's kind of an interesting aside. But in open country, where you have a lot of meadows and things like that, and Alaska, for instance, would be another example, and Montana, all of California is an exception, but you can use these what we call these modern parachutes. They're not exactly a parachute. I call them an airfoil, and you can turn on a dime. They could land on a dime. And you land standing up, that kind of thing. But with the old-fashioned dairy chute that we use here, where it works great in the brush, which we have a lot of brush in California. And we used to like to land, and our favorite landing spot would be what we call reproduction. Young trees about 100 foot tall, and you just come crash. It's like landing in a feather bed. It's just really nice. But also landing in the brush is good too. And the most difficult landing is landing on any kind of open ground. And we used to have this. They taught us what they call the Allen roll, and you can't do it in practice. So what we would, you can do it in practice. Let's see. Yeah, we do it in practice, but you can't do it when you're actually jumping. So we would turn 90 degrees. So when you land, you just land and roll, and you have to roll. If you don't roll, that's not good. And but anyway, the dairy chute is what we use in California, and it's like I say, if the BLM jumpers, Montana, they use these airfoils, and the show, what they put on for the private shows, all different jump teams and so on, they use all those, but that's always open country. They're not jumping in the brush. Okay, well, my first jump, we'd gone through the training for 3 weeks, and they'd practice, slap you on the leg, but when you're on a plane, get on the airplane going down the tarmac, the landings, and I said, uh-oh, this is it. There's no turning back. Okay, I had a bad position. For some reason, I don't know, I had a good position going out the door, but when you get out in the air, and when you're a smoke jumper, you're cinched down very tightly, and with your straps and so on. And so I don't know why, because that never happened to me again, but it would have to be in my first fire jump. And you come crashing down through the trees, which I call a soft landing. But let's see, my second year, we carried a letdown rope, a 100-foot letdown rope, so that if you land on a tree, and your parachute's hung up there, you have to use a letdown procedure. Which is just very simple, but you got to make sure. Like when I did it the first time, I almost stepped off the side without it being all hung over the branch. Oh, because that's important. But anyway, when there's this one jump, the loggers had come in to work on the fire, and in fact, this was up in Oregon. We usually didn't jump in Oregon, but we had a fire up in Oregon. And when it just so happened that my parachute hung up on the top of the tree, the ponderosa pine, which was fortunate. But I oscillated out, and then I oscillated back in again and hit my right hip against the trunk of the tree. It was painful, but anyway, I did the letdown procedure, and fortunately, it was only 100 foot off the ground. When you jump the Walla Whitman up further in Oregon, they carry 200-foot letdown ropes. Trees are even taller up there, but California trees, anyway, 100 foot is enough. So I did the letdown and got to the ground, and then I went to work and helped put out the fire. And but it was took me a while, but I still I got arthritis in my right hip. We were trained in what we call the Twin Beach, and the Twin Beach is similar to the Vega that Amelia Earhart flew and disappeared in. Excuse me. But the Twin Beach would take 4 smoke jumpers, and with that you'd sit in the door, and then they tap you on the shoulder and out you go. And my first so that was in the training. But then down in Reading, I was on the first stick of the first make the first fire jump. There were 2 squad leaders and 2 rookies, and I was one of the rookies. And I was the last man out. And we have a procedure that if you get rope lines over the top of, you can cut up to 4 lines. Well, I had what was called a Mae West. They were just two big boobs, and you couldn't cut any lines. And the standard procedure is to pop the reserve. And I didn't think of doing that, fortunately, because if you do that, you can get tangled in the main, and what we call it augering in. So I rode it in, and I passed the other guy in the air because I was going pretty fast, and landed on a rock, and a football helmet, where there's football helmet screen, and got a little cut in the back of my head, which I like to think saved my life. And then we had the padded suit and all that sort of thing. So I bounced off a rock and got a hairline fracture in my vertebrae at the bottom. And so I never did get to the fire. And this was on a Friday night. And so they go off and the Vietnam helicopters, a little Bell helicopter. That's what they did. And I put me on the litter and took me into Reading and they took an X-ray, and they said, "Oh yeah, you've got a hairline fracture there." And it wasn't painful. And so in jumping, if you get that kind of an injury, they put you right back on top of the jump list. And so on Friday, that was on Friday. On Monday, I was on the top of the jump list. It was okay, because they don't want you to get a chance to have second thoughts, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, it was okay. But I was scared on every fire. All my 41 jumps, I was scared on every one except one. And that was probably the most dangerous jump. We usually jump from 1,500 feet, and you have time to, it's wonderful. You look around, it's clear to blue sky, the airplane is leaving, and you corkscrew in to your landing. But the most dangerous one that I was never scared on, instead of being 50, we were probably down to 700 feet. And it just so happened we had our best spotter, or looper. And we were going through the smoke, and the plane was yawing, and there's 2 things, but yawing anyway. It was really rough, and because there was so much going on, you couldn't get scared. And so instead of getting out and having a chance to check anything, just went out the door, boom, and I was on the ground that fast. And like I say, this guy, Orb Looper, he went on to later to found he started the new program up in for the Bureau of Land Management in Alaska. But he was the best of the best. When you fly around looking for a place to jump, the spotter puts out drift streamers, and it's just crepe paper on a wire, and he watches the wind patterns. So from that, he can determine the best place to land, and also he knows the wind drift. And when you step out the plane, the pilot slows the engines, raises the tail, and then you step out, and so you don't get caught in the in a horizontal stabilizer. And yeah, so but the spotter is extremely important. And so I was fortunate to always have a good spotter. And the people that stay with it, with the professional jumpers, they all learn to be spotters and they do everything. But I did. And in those days, you could do it was a summer forestry job, and for forestry students, like for instance at Reading, we would go go over and color maps at the supervisor's office. But what we would do in the downtime, you pack parachutes, and we put all the parachutes in a bin, so you never know whose parachute you got. So you want to make sure you do it right. You do it right. And I did learn to pack parachutes, and that's not that a big a deal. But yeah, and yeah, it was a good experience. And some people go on. Men, and also in those days it was men only, or boys, but now they have women jumpers, and of course they fraternize and they get married and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, they're so it's really changed from being all male to, if you want to think about it, being a macho thing, it's not quite as macho as it used to be. But anyway, it's amazing because for a female, you got to go through all the same physical training. These women are really strong, and the same thing is true with L.A. County Fire. I mean, they have to carry hoses up the ladder, and all part of it. It's just amazing. You just got to be extremely strong and smart enough to do that. It's not just. Yeah, the Basin fire of 1961. There were 3 crews, and it just so happened that there had been a fire boss, and back in those days they were called bosses, and now they're chiefs. But now back in the fire, so the fire had been moving around, not doing much. So they brought in Dick Millar, who was the best fire boss in California, and Doug Leeds was his plans chief. So the two of them decided that this one particular day we were going to catch the fire and contain it. So we didn't have radios, any kind of communication. We didn't have briefings in the morning. We got up at daylight and went out, and I had the top sector, or I guess you'd call it a sector. And fortunately, I had Bill Buck, who was probably the best fireman out of the Southwest, and he was very famous in later years. And he'd been in the Marines, and he brought gold line rope with him. And I think we were assigned that sector because they figured Bill Buck could do this. Oh, and he had an Indian crew from Arizona, which were excellent. They had excellent training, good experience. So anyway, I start, and we have these safety rules. One is you keep the fire, know where the fire is. We didn't know where the fire was. Maintain communication. We had no communication. A dangerous situation is building fire downhill. We were building fire downhill, but we started out, and we actually had some rocky areas where Bill Buck got his rope out, and we had to rope down to get over these rock areas and get down. And so we got down over the rocky area, and we're building fire line, and the fire makes a run up the hill, and we could hear it roaring, and the smoke and was bad. And so we get down on the ground, and where the oxygen is, when there was about just enough to breathe some air, and the fire made a run, and I thought, we're going to die. and or we might. I just didn't say we are, but maybe. And so then the fire made a run, and then it backed off. And then Dick Millar, the fire boss, comes waltzing in. He said, "Okay, take it easy, boys. Everything's." And so the another one of the crew bosses was John Lively, who had been a smoke jumper with me, and he had another crew, and I forget the name of the third crew. But when that was all over, we got letters of commendation for doing a good job, and I had that. But it was, I thought and like all my smoke jumper fires, every fire I've been on have been routine, but this one was definitely not routine. And in fact, this Basin fire was the Pacific Southwest Forest Experiment Station author wrote a paper about it. I guess it was a big deal, I guess that's the best way of putting it. I don't have the paper anymore. I've lost it over the years. But anyway, it was quite a fire. And that was on the Sequoia National Forest, too, in the Kings River Canyon area. I started out as a saw log forester. And in those days, we cleared manzanita to plant trees. So they clear the brush to plant trees. And so that's appropriate, depending on your management objectives, especially up north. But down south of Tehachapi's, that's not our situation. Our situation down here is fire management in the chaparral. And managing chaparral is you manage by fire. I mean, that's the only thing. If you want to maintain it, if you try to clear it, it doesn't work very good. I talked to Wendy a little bit about that. But they tried it in San Diego County with the developers, and it's been extremely difficult, if not disastrous. And my role is to be an advocate for chaparral management south of Tehachapi's, and for Southern California. And that's really the whole southern, what used to be the Southern California Society of American Foresters, south at Tehachapi's and going up to San Luis Obispo and all that brush. Foresters call it brush, but the chaparral. And there's a little bit of oak mixed in there, but the foresters, well, that's a whole other issue, managing oaks, of course, on rangelands. But and I would say also I don't know that it needs my voice, but prescribed fire certainly. And I think that there's still some foresters, I think, that are reluctant. And of course, on private land, I can understand. If you work for a government agency, you can, how shall I say, you get a lot of protection. But if you're managing on private land, you have to have insurance, and it's riskier, because if you get an escape, it's difficult. If you have an escape and you work for, say, I'm guessing Cal Fire's like this, but I know the Forest Service. I mean, you can deal with it, and they have mechanisms for that, and they bring out. I know the Forest Service, when they do a prescribed fire, they bring out the fire trucks, and they first of all have a prescription, and do it under safe conditions. So they have. Occasionally there's an escape, but sometimes the winds, the weather. Actually, it's a weather change that catches them. So that is probably the risk. But I learned prescribed burning from Harold Biswell, when I was at Shaver Lake, and so I went to his first classes where I learned to back fire down in the pine needles, back it down the hill, and so a low intensity fire. And he called it, I think, also Indian burning, where the Indians would burn between patches of snow, or they would, for a large fire, they would build these huge fire to drive out the game, so for food. But generally, when we say Indian burning, we're talking about a low-intensity fire. Mary Ann was always the kids too, they were really, I don't recall ever having any problems with that. They were, because we didn't go to the places like Forks of the Salmon or Happy Camp. I mean, Shaver Lake was, how should I say, we had a slogan, closed on Wednesday. Everything shut down on Wednesday, but living there was, it was good. And Mary Ann volunteered at Pine Ridge School, and Rob and Chris, our children, went to school there, and they got, because they had good teachers in the elementary, were good teachers, they got a good education. So there was no problem with them moving around. And then when I took the job with the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, up in Anchorage, they all went along with that, as I recall, pretty good. It was quite an adjustment for coming from, say, Shaver Lake up into Anchorage. For Rob, they kept the 7th, 8th, and 9th grades together, and so he was 7th grade, and the 9th graders were not kind, shall we say. They were pretty mean, and so he had to adapt to that. And our daughter was elementary school at the local school, and I think she was okay with that, but they did have an adjustment to make with that. But when I decided to come back, returned to Edison, and fortunately got my job, not my job, but a job. They were, of course, happy to return down here. And you see, it would be 2000, what year? 1980, I think. Yeah. The date when Mount St. Helens blew up, Mary Ann was driving with the kids. They were one of the last cars to make it through coming south. But they were happy to get back to California. And I'd come down, and I bought the house, and I had to send a diagram up to Mary Ann so she could review it, and she liked the house, and that was not a problem. But the children had no adjustment. Once we were back down here, our daughter went locally here to the middle school, and then our son Rob was a freshman at Marina High School, which is really one of the best high schools in Huntington Beach. And so they were both, and they were fine with that. I don't think there's nothing more than that having to do with it being a forester. But over the years, the one thing is, I was telling Wendy, my sign went on, then Society of American Foresters. I joined as soon as I was possible when I was a junior in forestry school, and then a student member, and then when I graduated, became a member, and then in 1999, elected fellow. But over the years, I've been active down here in Southern California, and I've been policy chair, and I've done everything. I mean, all the different jobs, just about chair, vice chair, treasurer, secretary, and I was chair. Let's see, I remember. I've been chair twice. I've got the plaques up on the wall. I don't remember exactly the year, but it's maybe, say, 20 years ago, first time. And then the second time was more recently. Over the years, the Society of American Foresters has been what sustained me. And so it's really been a privilege to be a part of it and be active. And I was also, when I was up at Shaver Lake, I was chapter chair. And I was on the education committee for Northern Cal. And then I was chapter chair and vice chair. And I was telling Wendy, I brought in, when I was the vice chair is the one that arranges the programs, and I brought in, invited, and he came, Gordon Robinson, who at that time was the forester for the Sierra Club. And, of course, the Sierra Club was kind of like a swear word back in those days. And when I first started down here, we had the California Department of Forestry people were active. And in the last number of years, they never were. And, of course, there was the competition from the Licensed Foresters Association, and I think that probably drained off people who would be active. But we used to have a lot of outstanding members from California Department of Forestry here. Lower the rates, the dues. When I first joined, of course, I had a job, first of all, and they were affordable, and I was affordable. But I've talked to people down here that they would belong for the first few years and then drop it because they couldn't afford the dues anymore. And then we were talking with somebody today about, they put the emphasis on families, and also with modern technology, you can get so much information off the internet that or any whatever source you want, and with apps and whatever. So for an organization like Society of American Foresters to keep people interested, if you got people living in remote areas and they don't have good cell phone access or TV access, and I see that, but for people that live in the urban areas like down here, you get pretty much, I think, when the dues go up after the first 3 years, there's very little incentive really. And like I say, people are spending time. Well, they have other priorities too. You got their family. You got, soccer, being a soccer father, or whatever. All those things that are family things, and they compete with ASAF or any organization. And I never had that. I don't think that was an issue with me. I always SAF was so important to me that I was able to work, and Marianne was, supportive too. So it all worked out. But I think the young foresters now coming, and also you're getting. See, it's not just traditional foresters anymore. Like coming out of Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, you get they're majoring in recreation and fire management would be two that come to mind, and of course silviculture and being a traditional forester. But the ones that come down here go to work like for LA County would probably major in fire management or recreation, and so it's the world has changed a lot. It's not as traditional as it used to be. So I come from the old school, the traditional way of thinking. I try to adapt and stay up. In fact, I was telling Wendy or somebody, I study forestry every day, read something about forestry, and so because I want to keep current, it's really important to me. Keep my mind working and thinking. And I still have my shingle out as a consultant, but I don't. Not how shall I say? Field work is not really. If you got a job for me to do, I can do on a computer. I can do that. Well, I would say, if that's your passion, if that's what you want to do it. But don't do it because your parents or somebody is saying do it. If that's what you want to do, that's what that's what worked for me, and that's what the people who are, how shall I say, most successful follow their bliss. They do what they're, and that's been my passion. Although I've had doubts over the years and that sort of thing, but if I had to do over again, I guess, wow, I guess I would. Anyway, that's the only thing. When I was back in the days in 56 and 50s, that's the only environmental career there was. None of the others existed, and so forestry was the one thing you could do. And of course, now they have all these specialties. So you got, so many choices that. And now, and people that specialize in all these different things. So, someone who is considering forestry, it really has to be what you want, as compared to whatever. And let's say you want an outdoor type career, but you can be a geologist, for instance. That's how it can be an outdoor career. There's all kinds of, and ecologists and all the environmental science majors, and there's so many choices that I think to be a forester is something you really have to think about, and something you really have to want to do, and to eliminate the process of elimination. And of course, a lot of people go to college. Not a lot. Well, I don't know. Some people go to college. I know what I wanted right away, but they go to college and they change as they go. And that's okay. That's good. I didn't have any choice, and probably just as well. It gets too complicated, for like I mentioned. University of Minnesota, I was paying out-of-state tuition. I paid for everything except for got $50 in my senior year from my mother, another $50 from my uncle. Otherwise, I paid for all of it. And I had no debts and that's another thing, I don't know why. Well, I know why. It's because how times have changed. I don't think you can do that anymore. Well, at least I don't know that you can. So it's really difficult to make it on your own. So I don't know. I would want, I think I started out earlier by saying I don't like people telling me what to do. So if you get when my jobs at Shaver Lake, I didn't have anybody tell me what to do, and that's one reason I guess that was so rewarding. And I was an expert for the. That's a good feeling. To be. So, but anyway, I would say for a young person thinking about forestry, I think you got to make sure this is really what you want to do. And if you do, once you to thinking about everything else, if that's what you want, then go for it. Well, the first thing that pops into my mind is getting Cal Fire to have an intelligent vegetation management program. I can't believe they turned out that piece of crap a few years ago. That, in fact, it was so bad that all the scientists jumped on it. I mean, so many, 100 scientists, severely criticized them for it's just hard to believe. It was so political. I guess Cal Fire is so politicized that the future's not good. I'm being a pessimist now. But get the politics out of Cal Fire, or get it. Politics is everywhere. I understand that, but get it down to being a little more manageable and resource based. And for instance, just on the opposite spectrum, you've got the Forest Service, they've in many years they've had a vegetation management program, and they recognize the importance of all the plants, not just timber. But on the other hand, a couple of years ago, when they had the big fire up on Stanislaus, I think it was at Stanislaus, and the Forest Service, all the ecologists and scientists said leave it alone, but the Forest Service had to come in and do a timber sale. But here again, that wasn't the Forest Service politics. That was it Lagomarcino, the local congressman who lobbied to get the money to do that. So there was a lot of politics, and I don't know but the Forest Service too is subject to a lot of politics. I then get the politics reduced, I guess, for the Forest Service too. That get to reduce the timber influence. That I don't think that's possible. But I mean, we need I appreciate the fact we need the timber and so the private like Sierra Pacific Industries and Forest Service, for instance, and they actually. But you know how the Forest Service, it was so politicized, they were grossly overcutting in the 70s. I mean, it was just incredible, and foresters knew that. And but they were directed by the politics, so they had to do it. So I see when I think about the future of forestry, I say reduce the politics and make it more resource oriented, more scientifically oriented. And every forestry course I ever took always started out, such and such is the art and the science of. And so if you got the sound science, there's still going to be art, and that's where the professional decision comes in. So I guess I would, thinking about the future, I would say make it more science-based, and then let the professionals, and you know, as a registered forester, we have about a 300-page manual of all the rules and regulations, and I don't know how anybody. I mean, it's just a matter of interpreting rules and regulations. When we started out with the law, we had a one-page form we filled out, and it was all. What should I say? Professional opinion, if you want to call it that. And so, but it's gone to the other extreme now, hopefully they can figure out a way to reduce rules and regulations somehow, or make them at least manageable. And I know that Doug Pirro, for instance, was on the board of forestry for a while, and he participated in those decisions, and then get the politics out of Cal Fire. Well, not completely out, but it's run by the firemen, not by foresters. When I first came to California, it was California Department of Forestry, and the fire department was separate. Well, now because the wildland-urban interface, when they go to a fire, they don't go to put out the fire right away. The first thing they do is protect people and property. Then they put out the fire. And so I could see that as improvement for the future, especially with the Forest Service, to get the funding they need to do the job. In a perfect world, in 1776, before the foresters and mankind got a chance to manipulate it, and not that we haven't tried, we've done a good job, but in a perfect world, it was done by Mother Nature, and Mother Nature. How shall I say? You can't beat Mother Nature, or whatever it is, and so in a perfect world, we'd have the forests of what, 16, whatever, as they evolved over time. See, North America and America is blessed with all these natural resources, and we have these great weather conditions. Soil, everything is just right here, and but in the meantime, of course, we've done through mistakes. Some are honest mistakes, and some are political. But in a perfect world, I would say the natural forest, 1776. And as far as a managed forest, I guess to mimic those natural conditions as much as possible when we manage the forest. And that's it. Oh, yeah. Yeah. The cruiser stick, this is the same one like I used starting out in the Forest Service at the Big Bar, in this Big Bar district of the Shasta Trinity. And this is one I bought later, and I used it at Shaver Lake. But this has got a, let's see, it's got a first of all, it's got a yardstick. And in forestry, we do everything, or so many basic, basic. Here's just the yardstick. Yeah, there's the yardstick. A DBH, diameter breast high, 4.5 feet off the ground. Oh, and another little side story. At University of Minnesota, we used to have Foresters Day. And so we would go around with calipers and, how should I say, check out the girls, measure them. And so most of them got a kick out of that. Then the hypsometer is for either one chained, 66 feet, or chain and a half, 99 feet. But what I never did use that. I used a clinometer, and in the early days of Forest Service, we had an Abney level, and now I use a Sunto clinometer to do that. Let's see. The cruiser stick. Oh, the Biltmore. Oh yeah, the Biltmore side. That's where you put at DBH, you put it up against a tree and I think it's 30 inches out, and and you take you can estimate the DBH outside the bark, and then when you do the appraisal, then you convert everything to inside the bark. You use the logging. Now we used to use the logging charts and tables and all that sort of thing. Here's an increment bore, which once again we do it at DBH, and you go in at 4.5 feet off the ground, and let's see if I can get this. This really works good at softwood. It's very difficult in hardwood. Well, you go in, put that in like that. Then the core, this is the core. So you twist it and to get the core, and so you can count them. The reason you do this is to count the rings and get the age of the tree. And then you pull out the core. The core then is going to be on here, and you can count the rings. This is a scabbard. So you can hang it on your belt. This is a cruiser vest. And I start out with one in the Forest Service of a brown one, but I outgrew it. And so this is really, I actually used this one at Shaver Lake. And so in the old days, before we had these new sophisticated instruments that they do all the calculations, but Tamara tells me that they don't work in cloudy weather, so you still got to have the old-fashioned stuff. let's see, when I graduated from forestry school, the first thing I did was buy a Ranger compass, Silva Ranger compass. And you can get these in two types, either on azimuth or in quadrants. So I chose azimuth because you can convert to other units. So, and it's got a declination set up. You gotta, because you can't, how shall I say, true direction, you have to allow for azimuth for the declination due to the poles. So down here it's 16.5 degrees. So I have this set for Southern California. I'm lucky to be alive. It's been a good life, and it is a good life. I'm 78, and I keep saying 78 is great, and it is. And life gets better all the time. You know, and never thought that would. Well, I didn't know what to expect, but life does get better all the time for me. All things considered, there's, you know, but you lose some things, but you gain others. I guess wisdom, hopefully. Hopefully, wisdom. Although I do make, you got to make a lot of mistakes. I guess that's one thing that's important. You got to be willing to make mistakes to accomplish anything. And so I guess that would be and my basic philosophy of life is that we all do the best we can under the circumstances. And I've never seen an exception to that.